Well, really what we're exploring is it's, you might capture it in the concept of stress physiology. What we're looking at is what are the changes that occur very early in a seedling and in response to the presence of weeds. And what we find is that the plants are changing very quickly. The growth pattern of those plants are changing. And when we change the growth pattern of a plant by having it communicate through light signals with a weed species, we actually change the response, the ability of that plant to respond to future stress down the road. So where does the yield part come in? We find that with early detection of weeds, we can change the growth pattern of the crop, and some of those changes actually persist all the way to the end of the growth cycle of the plant. And we can show that where we can actually drop kernel number just by early exposure to the weed. And so that's an amazing thing to think about, that how the seedling is affected early on can actually affect the fitness of the plant or the reproductive output at the end. And then the second part of that is as we make these changes, for example, we can have a corn plant or a soybean plant or possibly a canola plant as well, and we can slide up a weed alongside it, and we can change the root structure with no physical contact whatsoever. A bit like a little magic here. You know, how can that happen? But if we start to change, for example, a root structure, you're going to change the ability of that plant to withstand stress. So it's understanding those types of reactions and those types of changes that we're hoping to try to provide better agronomic information, better knowledge that will help growers get better yields at the end of the day.
Now, I know your research in the past has dealt just on the corn side, or at least that's the stuff that I've been most familiar with. And now you say soybeans and canola seem to have that same response?
Right. Well, we've done the work on soybeans as well. And what I believe that we are doing, we're working on principles. We believe that what we see in corn and soybeans happens in all crops. Possibly the degree to which they adjust will differ, but the principle that we work on is pretty universal. So
now, talking again about corn, and you talk about how early on this detection of the plant to the weed is. I mean, are we talking emergence? Are we talking a little later in the early stage? Where is that?
Well, it appears from our research that as soon as the plant comes out of the ground, you know, we often think of a plant being quite stationary, you know, just sitting there and the leaves blowing in the wind. But this research has really opened my eyes, in particular to the fact that as soon as that seedling comes above the ground, and possibly even before it gets above the ground, it's beginning to detect its environment. It's beginning to pick up the temperature and the humidity readings and the sunlight readings, and also what surrounds it. So this is a phenomena that appears to be very, very early. Changes are occurring by the minute, and then as the plant gets larger and grows away from the signal or whatever, it becomes more tolerant and can change. So it's definitely a phenomena that's happening very early. And this is where we talk about changing the way people look at management, because oftentimes we judge management by the way the field looks at the harvest time. And my suggestion would be that probably how the field looks at harvest has nothing to do with good management. Good management has everything to do with what the early seedling establishment looks like and how clean you can keep the fields at that time.
Is there a time in that crop life that all of a sudden it stops detecting weeds as much as it does early on?
Yeah, we're most sensitive in the first few leaf stages. As the plant gets larger, it's harder to detect those changes because the signal has to be fairly close to the newest growing areas. And so as it grows away and gets taller than, for example, the weed species, then the plant begins to handle that very much easier. So it's something that has to be close. The signal has to be within about 10 centimeters. and it has to be close to the growing point.
So by the time we hit, kind of 5-6 leaves, we're past that. Weed control is most important in those first few leaf stages.
That's correct. And the interesting thing is that you can control weeds at the 6 or 8 leaf stage, whatever you choose, and the field's going to look clean and the crop's going to look good. And this is what it's difficult because you can't see this effect. And so it's a very subtle effect, but it's also a very real effect.
Then just finally here, can you give me more of an explanation in terms of, you talk about the root structure changing when it detects that weed. What changes about that?
Well, basically, we can change the total amount of biomass. We can affect the architecture and the distribution of those roots within the soil. So if you think about if we change rate of growth, for example, so we can alter the rate of growth, architecture, biomass, so that we have a different root system under the ground than a healthy plant. And so then when a stress comes, we haven't got the same structure underneath the ground to help deal with stress. And certainly the roots are going to be a critical component of helping a plant deal with stress.